Wild Lioness recognizes woman who saved her life 5 years ago, but then, the morning heat pressed against Dr. Sarah Chen's shoulders as she knelt beside the GPS collar, her fingers working methodically through the data download. 3 hours into her survey of the Northern Territory, the savanna stretched endlessly around her, a tapestry of golden grass punctuated by the occasional fever tree. Her Land Rover sat 50 meters away, engine ticking as it cooled in the shade of an ancient baobab. The first sign wasn't sound, it was the sudden absence of it. The weaver birds fell silent mid-song, and even the persistent buzz of tsetse flies seemed to pause. Sarah's hands stilled on the equipment, and when she looked up, her breath caught in her throat. Golden eyes watched her from the tall grass, unblinking and steady. The lioness stood motionless 30 meters away, her massive frame barely visible through the swaying stalks. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain perfectly still, her training taking over even as recognition began to stir somewhere deep in her memory. The lioness took a step forward, then another. Her movements were deliberate, almost cautious, lacking the predatory fluidity Sarah had observed in countless other encounters. There was something else in the way she held her head, the careful placement of each paw, something that made Sarah's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't yet name. "Easy, girl," Sarah whispered, the words barely audible even to herself. The lioness paused at the sound, her ears twitching forward. And in that moment, as sunlight caught the distinctive scar running along her left shoulder, Sarah's world tilted. The mark was faint but unmistakable, a pale line cutting through the tawny fur, a remnant of wire and desperation and long nights in a makeshift clinic 5 years ago. Kasai. The name formed silently on Sarah's lips as memories flooded back. The tiny, broken cub with infected wounds. The weeks of bottle feeding and antibiotic injections. The day she'd finally been strong enough to return to the wild, disappearing into the grassland without looking back. Now she stood before Sarah as a full-grown lioness, nearly 200 pounds of muscle and grace. But those same amber eyes held a flicker of something that transcended the wild space between them. Kasai moved closer, her massive paws silent against the earth. 20 meters. 15. Sarah remained frozen, scarcely breathing, as the lioness approached with the careful deliberation of an animal making a choice. At 10 meters, Kasai stopped. Her great head tilted slightly, studying Sarah's face with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the years. The researcher felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she couldn't say whether they were born of fear, wonder, or something far more complex. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the earthy smell of the savanna after the morning's heat. Kasai's nostrils flared, and Sarah watched as recognition fully bloomed in those golden depths. The lioness made a soft sound, barely more than a breath, but it carried across the space between them like a greeting. Time seemed suspended in the warm air. Sarah's research equipment lay forgotten beside her, the data cables trailing in the dust, as she stared into the eyes of a creature she had helped save, now fully grown and magnificent in her wild strength. The moment stretched between them, fragile as morning mist, filled with the weight of shared history and the impossible bridge that had been built between human hands and a wild heart that had never forgotten. The weight of that shared gaze carried Sarah back through time, to another morning when the sun had climbed just as high and the grass had whispered with the same restless wind. 5 years dissolved like morning mist as she remembered the radio call that had changed everything. Reports of snares discovered near the western boundary, the urgent need for someone to investigate before more wildlife fell victim to the wire traps. She had been younger then, newer to the conservation work, her hands still soft from graduate school as she'd driven the narrow track toward the reported coordinates. The metallic glint caught her attention first, barely visible through the thornbush where the poacher had concealed his trap. But it was the sound that stopped her heart, a weak, rasping cry that spoke of pain beyond measure. The cub had been there for hours, possibly days. Wire bit deep into her left hind leg, the crude snare drawn so tight that infection had already begun its cruel work. She couldn't have been more than 3 months old, her spots still vivid against fur that should have gleamed golden but was instead matted with blood and dirt. When Sarah approached, the cub tried to snarl, but the sound came out as little more than a broken whisper. "It's okay, little one," Sarah had murmured. keeping her voice barely above a breath as she assessed the damage. The rescue itself became a blur of careful movements and whispered reassurances. Sarah's hands trembled as she worked to free the wire, each twist of the cutters causing the cub to flinch and whimper. The leg was nearly severed, held together by sinew and stubborn will, and Sarah knew that without immediate intervention, the small life would slip away within hours. The drive back to base camp stretched into eternity. The cub lay motionless in a transport crate, her breathing shallow and rapid, amber eyes glazed with fever. Sarah spoke continuously during that journey, her voice a steady stream of comfort, though she wasn't certain the words reached through the cub's haze of pain and exhaustion. What followed were weeks that blurred together in a rhythm of feeding schedules and medication times. The veterinarian had been brutally honest about the cub's chances. The infection was severe, the trauma extensive. But something in those amber eyes, even dulled by suffering, convinced Sarah to fight for every breath, every heartbeat. The first breakthrough came on day 12, when the cub managed to lift her head during a feeding. Sarah had been administering milk replacer through a syringe, as she had dozens of times before, when tiny teeth grazed her finger, not in aggression, but in a desperate attempt to suckle. The gesture was so fundamentally hopeful that Sarah found tears streaming down her cheeks. Recovery unfolded in small victories. The fever broke on day 18. The cub began eating solid food on day 25. By the 6th week, she was attempting to stand, her damaged leg weak but determined to bear weight. Sarah named her Kasai, Swahili for born during hard times, and watched as wild instincts slowly reasserted themselves despite the circumstances. The bond that formed between them existed in the spaces between necessity and affection. Sarah provided what the cub needed to survive, nothing more, yet Kasai began to respond to her approach with soft chuffs of recognition. When Sarah entered the rehabilitation enclosure, Kasai would lift her head, ears forward, eyes tracking every movement with an awareness that went beyond simple hunger or fear. As strength returned to that small body, so did the wildness that belonged there. Kasai grew restless in captivity, pacing the boundaries of her enclosure, her gaze constantly drawn to the horizon beyond the fence. Sarah recognized the signs and knew their time together was drawing to a close. The memory faded as gently as it had come, leaving Sarah kneeling in the present moment with Kasai standing before her. No longer the broken cub she had once cradled, but a magnificent lioness in her prime. The recognition between them hung in the air like morning mist, fragile and profound, until Kasai took another step forward and then, impossibly, turned away. The lioness moved with purpose, her powerful shoulders rolling beneath tawny fur as she began walking toward a distant copse of umbrella thorns. After several paces, she stopped and looked back at Sarah, amber eyes holding a quiet invitation that transcended the barriers between species. Sarah understood with the certainty that comes from years of reading animal behavior. She was being asked to follow. Rising slowly from her crouch, Sarah left her equipment scattered in the grass and began to walk. Kasai maintained a distance of perhaps 20 meters, moving with the fluid grace of apex predation but without urgency, pausing occasionally to ensure Sarah remained behind her. The tall grass brushed against Sarah's legs as they traveled, creating a whispered symphony that seemed to announce their passage to the savannah. They walked for nearly 10 minutes, Sarah's heart hammering with anticipation and wonder. Kasai led her away from the open grassland toward a thicket dense with acacia and wild sage, the kind of sheltered place that offered protection from both predators and the relentless African sun. As they approached the thornbush barrier, Kasai slowed and turned to face Sarah once more, her expression unreadable but somehow expectant. Then Sarah heard it, the softest mewing, barely audible above the rustle of leaves. Kasai moved aside, creating a clear line of sight into the shadowed heart of the thicket, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. 3 cubs tumbled over one another in the dappled light, their spots vivid against fur still soft with youth. They couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old, their eyes bright with curiosity as they wrestled and played in complete safety. When they noticed their mother's return, they bounded toward her with unsteady steps, tiny voices raised in greeting. Kasai settled among her cubs with the careful grace of experienced motherhood, allowing them to climb across her massive frame and nuzzle against her warmth. But her eyes remained fixed on Sarah, who stood motionless at the edge of the thicket, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "You did it," Sarah whispered, her voice barely more than breath. You survived. In this hidden sanctuary, surrounded by new life that bore testament to resilience and the continuation of wild lineages, Sarah understood that she was witnessing something far beyond a simple reunion. Kasai had brought her here not by accident but by choice, sharing the most precious thing she possessed with the human who had once held her life in gentle hands. The cubs continued their play, oblivious to the magnitude of the moment, their small voices creating a melody of pure contentment. Above them, the acacia leaves rustled in the warm wind, and somewhere in the distance, a fish eagle called across the endless expanse of grass and sky.